Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. We've got a wonderful program for you today on the security challenges that Moldova faces in light of a revisionist Kremlin foreign policy. You have in front of you the speaker's bio, so I will not go through them. It's just so we have a strong panel. I just wanted to make one remark to lead this event off. The Atlantic Council believes strongly that we face a major security challenge in what some people call the gray zone, that in-between space between NATO and the EU on the west and Russia on the east. And that the refusal so far to understand this is a singular problem, connecting events in Georgia with events in Moldova, with events in Nagorno-Karabakh, with events in Crimea and Donbass, has been an obstacle to clear Western policy. The United States needs to understand, our partners in NATO and the EU need to understand this challenge. And we'll be doing a host of events. We did an event a couple of weeks ago with the President of Georgia. We have this event today on the security challenges facing Moldova. We'll be doing events going forward, as we have on Ukraine in the past, to highlight this as a one-issue area where there are other nuances, of course, but where you have to have the general strategic understanding to pursue the right policies. And with that, I turn this over to our moderator, Mark Simakovsky. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for coming. My name is Mark Simakovsky. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a vice president at Beacon Global Strategies. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have such a great panel here today, and of course the participants. And this panel comes at an interesting day, a day where the United States has announced the expulsion of a significant number of U.S. diplomats, a closure of a consulate, as well as, frankly, an unprecedented transatlantic cooperation of expulsions that, in my memory, has never happened before, where multilaterally we pursued the expulsion and a reaction of Russian actions abroad. And again, it lays out color for our discussion today, which is Russian influence in Moldova. With us, we have assembled a great panel that cover a whole range of issues in Moldova. Agnieszka Gmys-Wiktor, who's a program officer at National Endowment for Democracy. She's been leading the endowment's work in Moldova over the past half-decade. Ambassador John Herbst, who I thank for leading the Atlantic Council's efforts, not only on Moldova, but countries surrounding Russia and the former Soviet Union, who's had a great year focused on Moldova, who was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. We also have Ambassador Hill, who has a long experience, probably more than any other U.S. official in Moldova, and has been working a lot with the Atlantic Council on understanding and tracking Russian influence in Moldova. And finally, we luckily have a participant who doesn't need an introduction from Moldova, Mr. Dumitru Mînzărari. He's a State Secretary for Defense Policy, International Cooperation in the Ministry of Defense. When I worked at the Pentagon in Moldova, his office was my interlocutor on deepening U.S. Moldovan defense ties, and he has a long-range government and non-governmental experience, and particularly will be able to help us understand Moldova's security environment. Again, Russian influence in Moldova has been something that is long-standing, historical. There's obviously a lot of interest now in Russian influence around the world. It's interesting in that particularly you have a time where Russian military presence, Russian overt and covert influence operations, Russian money for politicians are in the news daily, and all of these things have been in Moldova for a long time, and in particular coming up to elections that Moldova faces later this year for parliament. Russia's role will be very influential. So, I'll jump right into questions with this panel. What have you seen, first off, Mr. Mînzărari, of the trajectory of Russia's influence in Moldova over the past few years, and some of the nuances, and how do you see that moving forward, particularly with events that have occurred in Ukraine, particularly with the way that the United States and the EU has been unwilling to engage Moldova over the past few years, and what is the challenges that Moldova faces with some of this foreign influence?
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and have the opportunity to speak with such a diverse audience here at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to start answering your question by providing some conceptual framework for my answer. So today we have in the media, especially the analysts who assess developments in the defense sector, pointing out to the fact that advances in artificial intelligence together with the unmanned vehicle will change the face of warfare. As a social scientist by training, and studying the Russian foreign and security policy in the region, and specifically Moldova, to me it was surprising to see how an advance in social sciences is being weaponized, how our better knowledge of social sciences, how our better understanding of people preferences, our ability to influence people behavior is able also to change the face of the warfare. And we can make a parallel with the recent headlines here in the US, where you have Cambridge Analytica collecting individual data in order to affect people's behavior, to use them in elections and so on. So imagine this is done in a context related to the traditional goals of warfare. And warfare has been traditionally used to conquer territory, to control territory, to control policy, to control resources. And one of the reasons why we have seen it's a rare event, any social scientist you talk to, you will be told that interstate wars is a rare event. One reason why it is so, especially over the last 50 or 60 years, is because there are costs. There are political costs, domestic political costs, there are international political costs. So what this advance in social sciences allows a potential aggressor to do is to diminish those costs. And I'd like to go from this abstract description to a concrete example. There is this buzzword, hybrid warfare, that people are using a lot. One of the definitions is that it's a mix of conventional military tools with the non-kinetic tools. But looking at the concrete manifestation, how it was operationalized in the Republic of Moldova for years, you can see that the same goals were followed to control territory, resources, or policy by controlling or influencing people. And in light of the coming elections, this is very important. Imagine if a foreign actor has the ability, and very strong ability, to influence the choice of the people during elections. You don't need to conquer a country militarily. You can install a government that will be loyal to you, and you basically make a satellite state that would support you in your foreign policy, that would host your military base, and that would basically promote whatever policy you tell them to do. And one of the dangers that many analysts in Moldova see is that the elections that we have this year might come close to such a scenario. So I will add to this later in the discussion. I'd just like to give the opportunity to other speakers to talk about that.
Ambassador Hill, would love your opinion both on the trajectory, but also give us some historical context also of the way that Russia has engaged in Moldova over the last 20 years, and how has that changed, or how it has not changed, frankly, particularly because Moldova has had subsequent elections that have changed from more a pro-EU orientation to a more neutral orientation, or even with the current president, a more special relationship with Moscow.
Right. Right. Thanks very much, and thanks, Mark, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me, including me in this panel. I mean, Moldova has been in a gray zone or gray area or in between for more than 25, for 200 or 300 years at least. I mean, Moldova sits right where the Slavic world and the Mediterranean world come together. And there has been a Russian presence and Russian influence there since the 1600s, or certainly the 1700s. It's gone up and down, changed in character over time. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has aimed to exercise either primary or exclusive influence in Moldova, as in other countries in the former Soviet Union. I mean, in 1999, Yevgeny Primakov told me that his aim was to maximize Russian influence in Moldova. Didn't surprise me. I don't see that aim has changed. And Russia has considerable advantages in the sense of long-standing and fairly deep cultural, historical, and linguistic ties with part of the population there. And so I agree with Secretary Mînzărari that the Russian influence, the Russian campaign, the Russian threat is as much political and cultural, or perhaps more political and cultural than security or military. And in this sense, Russia has certain advantages, certain tools. And in this, I see Transnistria more as a means to an end, rather than a primary aim of Moldova. And the influence or control over the actions of the Transnistrian entity are aimed at increasing Russian influence, Russian presence in Moldova proper. I mean, Russia has a number of pluses. The troop presence is a political factor more than, it's not a very big troop presence, but politically it's important because they're there and it restricts some things Moldova can do. Russia's position as a mediator in the Transnistrian settlement process enables Russia to participate in Moldovan politics in a way that a country not part of that process wouldn't be able to. And Moldova's long-standing economic and energy ties, in some sense, not so much anymore dependence, although energy it's still very, very important, but these are all an advantage to the Russians. The minuses, Russia is physically separated, and that's important. Especially after the 2013, 2014 events in Ukraine. And in Moldova since 1989 or the late 1980s, there's been a general movement, even among those with a cultural affinity to things Russian, a sense that Moldova has a post-Soviet, post-1989 return to Europe. And this return to Europe is often in juxtaposition to Russian desires or Russian desires to restrict Moldova's freedom of action or freedom of choice. The minuses on the Western side is that in the 2000s, you had a government, the Voronin communist government, that started out as very pro-Russian, and turned eventually to the European Union, lost an election, lost power in 2009, but in 9 years of a pro-European government, there has been considerable trouble with continued spectacular corruption and failure of reform that has gone a long way to making large portions of the otherwise pro-Western, pro-European Moldovan population very disillusioned and tending to see both Russian and Western sides as the same, seeking only geopolitical advantage rather than bringing systemic advantages. And this all plays into the current elections where, as far as we can tell, Moldova faces in its parliamentary elections this year a real choice, with about half of the electorate clearly tending, it seems, towards a pro-EU, pro-European choice, and another half of the electorate towards a pro-Russia, pro-Eurasian Union choice. They seem, according to the polls, to be very closely, very evenly balanced. And then thus there is significant opportunity for foreign involvement in key places to throw parts of the race one way or the other, and a race that's evenly balanced. Just a couple of seats or a couple of percentage points could be very important in determining the immediate future geopolitical direction of the country and the effects that has for the whole region.
Ms. Wiktor, this is maybe the perfect transition for you, particularly
Yes,
with how you're
thank you very
seeing
much. Thanks, Mark.
this landscape, this schism between pro-West and Russian forces. And Russia has been nimble in understanding and changing its policies to adapt to certain environments. And Moldova is an environment, obviously, that they can create a large effect with fewer resources than a place like Ukraine. So I would love your view of the landscape there.
Thanks very much. But if you don't mind, I would like to
Absolutely.
say a few words about what Russia has been doing in Moldova. I agree that it has been exerting pressure on Moldova for years, but it has significantly grown after the Maidan revolution, after signing the association agreement. When Moldova initialed, probably most of you remember that, but after Moldova initialed the association agreement with the EU in 2013, Russia imposed economic sanctions. It banned the import of agricultural products and wine, which actually cost the Moldovan economy quite a bit. And it launched a very vicious campaign in the media. You also have to remember Russian media are very popular, and most people watch and trust them in Moldova. Launched a vicious campaign against Ukraine, against the EU, spreading false information about, presenting the Ukraine Maidan revolution as a coup that was sponsored by the West in an attempt to overthrow a legitimately elected president. This campaign has been was very effective, and particularly in areas where ethnic minorities live. And I would like to mention Gagauzia here. Gagauz people were terrified that Romania of what happens after the Maidan revolution. The media spread information that Romania would invade them, would possibly maybe execute those people who don't speak the Romanian language, and most of the Gagauz people don't speak the language. And so on. So the fears were real, and as a result, we remember the illegal referendum was held in early 2014, where most of the Gagauz people said that they are for that Gagauzia should leave Moldova if Moldova chooses to reunite with Romania. In general, the point I would like to make here is that Russia has been very skillful at exploiting weaknesses of the countries in which it is working, and one of those weaknesses is the fact that the Moldovan state has failed to integrate minorities in the country, and this is why the Gagauz people responded the way they did. I think I will stop here. Yeah.
Ambassador Herbst?
Mm-hmm.
I think that in Moldova, as in Georgia and Ukraine, we see two large sets of challenges. The one challenge is a Kremlin that asserts it has the right to a sphere of influence. It has the right to dominate not just the national security policy of its neighbors, but internal political questions of interest and value to them. That's on the one side. And the other large set of problems, the whole question of transforming a society that was part of the Soviet Union into a free and open economy and political system. And these two sets of problems play off each other. Now, one particular problem that I have with analyses of countries in this region is to somehow assume that the most important equation is that of the East versus the West, as if it's the United States or the West on the one side and Russia on the other, whose equities need to be managed in this area. This analysis forgets the other, and I would say easily the most important factor, which is the choices of the people involved. So while, yes, it's true that Russia has a centuries-long history of involvement in this area that the United States does not and cannot match, it's true that the Russian interest in Moldova is not as great, not nearly as great as the people of Moldova. And the same is true for Ukraine and for Georgia, and for that matter, any other country in between, the West and the East. And our policy should start with that understanding. So, there's a crisis in Ukraine, where we see this at the moment, the largest measure, and a crisis in Moldova for 25 years, because one, there are some internal difficulties, but two, the Kremlin is not willing to permit these countries to resolve those difficulties in their own fashion. The problem is, as Mr. Primov told Bill, and I'd like to have more information on this, that yes, it's Russia's objective to dominate Moldova. And there was a time where these sorts of principles were considered normal, but in a decade or a century which saw the United States make a kind of peace with Castro's Cuba, to accept Russia's right to run roughshod over the wishes of the people of Moldova is not something that we should go along with. And we should understand this is both a challenge to our principles, but also to our interests. Because there's no reason why the countries in this area in between should be a locus of instability. They're a locus of instability because the Kremlin is playing upon problems in these countries to assert its will. If we allow this to happen, it will. If we say no, this is unacceptable, and we impose costs on Moscow for its aggression, over time it will cease.
So moving to concretely what you're seeing, I think it would be great to get a perspective from you, particularly Mr. Mînzărari, about, some would say that Russia's approach to Moldova has been milder than Georgia and Ukraine. And again, that's a very threatening bar, because both those countries were invaded by Russian forces. You already have the presence of Russian forces on your territory. But also Russia has tried to play to the Moldovan public by not recognizing Transnistria, continue to maintain a semblance of engagement on resolving the conflict. How has the Ministry of Defense and Moldovan institutions, particularly in the last few months and years, been able to deal with the way that Russia has had a different approach to Moldova? And what are some of your recommendations of how the United States and the European Union should be more involved in actually helping Moldova insulate itself from foreign influence?
So continuing my thoughts from the previous intervention, I will provide a couple of other examples of this operationalization of Russian influence. One of them is, for instance, using its dominance, and it still continues to dominate the Moldovan mass media market, to portray NATO and United States as basically very negative actors. And by doing this, it creates among a large part of the population the rejection for any assistance that US and NATO is offering the Moldovan government. So basically, it's like a virus that when invades the body, it presents itself as a benign organism, and by this, it does not allow the immune system to fight until it's too late. So this approach is basically telling a significant number of people that trust the Russian media that what you get, the help from US and NATO, is a bad thing. So we have this opposition, for instance, for exercises with NATO that allows us to train and so on. So that's one way that we see that being operationalized. Another way, which is very, I think, pertinent today, given the visit of Mr. Frattini, who is an Italian former Minister of Foreign Relations and represents the Italian chairmanship of OSCE. He's going to be over those couple of days in Moldova discussing the Transnistrian conflict. So one of the longest hybrid type of operations in Moldova has been of portraying the Transnistrian conflict as an inter-ethnic one. So when you portray a conflict as an inter-ethnic, you basically suggest that a specific set of tools has to be involved and projects in order to address it. So you have to look at confidence building measures, you have to look at creating ability for the two conflict sides to talk and so on. Because in the early 90s the West was not much interested in the Transnistrian conflict, this framing was accepted. There was also not a lot of funding for researchers, both academic and policy oriented, to dig deeper into the origins of the conflict. So you basically, this mythology about Transnistrian conflict being an inter-ethnic one was created. And today we have a negotiation format, we have a peacekeeping format that Russia imposed on Moldova after the short war ahead in '92. And because we didn't have this insulation that West would provide to us and that Ukraine has today, right? Ukraine refused the format that Russia wanted to impose on it in relation to the eastern regions, because its Western friends basically stepped in and said, no, this is not acceptable. So Moldova did not have this advantage in the early 90s. And this format was imposed on us. So basically we have today this format where Russia controls, where we cannot take any decision, we cannot respond to incidents without the permission of the Russian members of those meetings. Where we have something that is, it's unbelievable, where we have a peacekeeping operations that do not follow United Nations standard of impartial peacekeeping, where a party to the conflict is basically a member of the peacekeeping operation. This would be unbelievable if you think about some other context, but this is what is happening in Moldova. So that's another way that Russia has been using political operations and what we refer to as hybrid warfare to consolidate its influence. And the other panel members refer to the influence of the Russian media, the ability to control the media space. One of the reasons why this is, in fact, is true is because the quality of the Moldovan media channels, entertainment quality in particular, is not as good as the Russian entertainment product that is provided. And this is obvious because the amount of money that it invested to produce this entertainment content is significantly higher than Moldova can invest. So through a large number of population being Russian-speaking, they are attracted to those channels. Then there is another overlap that in Moldova, the majority of the population, they tend to take their news feed from the TV stations. So therefore, that's what they usually watch in order to get news. And also TV is one of the most trusted source of news. So when you put all of this together, there is no wonder that there is a significant ability of the Russia to influence the perceptions of the Moldovan public through its media. And this was one of the reasons why the Moldovan government took the steps some months ago to restrict the ability of Russia to use to basically influence the local population. There is another important element that we should add to the equation. We have seen in the Western countries where the public has a political culture, a very developed political culture, where the public is critical. And nevertheless, those fake news and those strategies to build specific perceptions of the public, they were successful in many instances. Now imagine a smaller country where there is not a huge diversity of the media, where the political culture of the population is still in the development, right? Where people are not very critical in assessing the news for different reasons. And here you have the perfect conditions to actually impose on the public to build, to construct new realities for the public. And this is actually one of the way that Russia is able to provide, to generate support for specific parties in Moldova. This is one of the things. Second element, when we speak about how the Russian influence in Moldova has been evolving, I'd like to point out an interesting fact which is closer to my portfolio. Following the Russian-Georgian War in 2008, there was a significant increase in military activities in Transnistria that were conducted by the Russian military forces there together with the armed forces of the separatist administration in Tiraspol, which is in itself, it's a violation of the peacekeeping principles, because you have the Russian forces which are supposed to provide an environment where the conflict cannot be a conflict outbreak again. They are basically training one of the actors that they portray the second party to the conflict. So from 2008 until today, there was a steady increase in military activities. A second spike was in 2014 after the events, the conflict in Ukraine. And the highest number of military activities was last year, which we counted around 300 military activities, which roughly can be every single working day there was one military activity in Transnistria. Most of them would involve trainings, military exercises at relatively small scale. They included, for instance, crossing of the river, which is an offensive operation, considering that the left bank and right bank, or the left bank Transnistrian region, is separated from Moldova. So you will train to cross the river, and you'll train to launch operations only if you prepare to do that in reality, because it's an investment. It's a credible signal. It's a costly signal to do that. Some other elements of the training, including training snipers, training special forces. So all those elements were observed. Now, because this is so costly to do, and the military budget of the separatist administration is very low, they cannot pay salaries. So Russia is monthly providing money, or used to provide money, for them to be able to pay salaries to the administration. So imagine that they're conducting a lot of activities. That money has to come from somewhere. That's a huge investment. And if you invest money into such an activity, that means that you do have a specific purpose. So some of my colleagues in the civil society analysts would say, well, maybe they're just trying to scare you, to discuss, to talk with to put pressure on the European Union so that they tell you to go and talk with the Transnistrians. But to do this, you don't need 300 military activities a year. You can do a few. Our military analysts, they consider that this is done in order to prepare for a potential scenario when there will be a need to use military forces. Another basically idea that pops up in the discussions where we talk about those exercises is, well, there is a very small scale involving levels of maybe a few platoons, company. But the armed forces of Moldova are quite small. I think overall we have about over 3,000 uniformed people. On the other side, in Transnistrian region, we have about 15,000 plus some. So training at the scale of 100 people, 200 people, 500 people regularly, that's very significant. Imagine that you would have in North Korea battalion level training on a daily basis next to the separation line. I mean, that's a strong signal. So some of my colleagues from the civil society that do military and security analysis, they suggest that given the dynamics that they see in Moldova today, they see a couple of scenarios. So one scenario is that Russia is investing a lot in the forthcoming elections through the social conflict technology that I was referring to. That means influencing specific groups of voters, providing support to specific parties that they would like to support, discrediting their opponents, so that they can take control over Moldova through elections. And that's an element of the hybrid warfare, and we're discussing earlier with Ambassador Hill that this is why particularly it's very difficult to counter that kind of approaches, because it disguises itself behind the democratic. It uses democratic processes that we usually have to basically implement aggressive actions and policies that usually you would do through regular warfare. And that would be one scenario. A second scenario that our analyst discusses potential is in case they don't manage to get a control over the parliament in the elections, then to stage protests similar to what were happening in eastern Ukraine, and under their disguise to basically say that we disagree with the result of the voting. Elections were fabricated, and under the cover of those protests to create some I don't know, Gagauz Popular Republic and so on, and to copy, to basically use the same things that Russia used in the same approach that Russia used in Luhansk and Donetsk region of Ukraine. It is under this scenario that they see the military forces as instrumental, because they could be used to take over some of the villages, to cross the river, and to distract attention while this Luhansk or Donetsk scenario is being implemented in Moldova.
So, Mr. Mînzărari, you laid out some definite scenarios for this year. One of the things, and again, I open up to any of the speakers to address, is Ambassador Herbst mentioned there's a thread of how Russia uses its influence, not only in Moldova, but throughout the countries around its periphery. And again, this thread is taken in the context of now the West and the United States and the EU and also NATO taking actions in response to those actions. Can you, in your determination of what is both feasible but is what is recommended, lay out some steps of how the United States, what it should do regarding the actions that Russia is taking in Moldova, and also potentially the willingness of this administration, frankly, to come up with a policy for countries in this region, let alone for Russia, which is obviously still conflicted?
Thank you, Mark. But I was,
Let's turn to some of the other speakers, Ambassador Herbst or Ambassador Hill or Agnes.
In the mid-90s, I was in something at State Department called SNIS, which was the equivalent of a bureau for the post-Soviet space. And I was a deputy in SNIS. And I had to, at times, speak publicly about US policy towards Russia. And I remember we would divide our policy towards Russia into 5 areas. And one of them was arms control, another was the economy, another was the political system, another was the near abroad, and I forget the 5th. But I remember giving speeches in '94 and '95, and again, this was when Yeltsin was moving steadily in the direction of democracy and market reform, despite all the problems of market reform in Russia. And I remember giving speeches in which I said that if you look carefully at Russian policy in all areas, from the standpoint of American interests and American principles, it was pretty good, with one exception: the problem of the near abroad. And as we've discussed in this panel, the policies Moscow was pursuing in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Transnistria, in Abkhazia, were essentially imperial policies. And our policymakers, in the enthusiasm for the relationship with Moscow, which again, on balance, was pretty good, let them get away with it. People at my level and at lower levels would comment on the unsatisfactory nature of Russian policies, including the fact, as we've heard, that we allowed a peacekeeping regime which involved an important accomplice to the crime, meaning Russian forces. And we just didn't pay any real policy attention to it. And we established a pattern, even when you had a liberal, relatively speaking, liberal government in Moscow, of Kremlin imperial policies. And of course, it only became a crisis in this century when Moscow decided to conduct a war against Georgia. Although even if you look carefully at the politics of that war in the West, there were a lot of Putin verstehers who talked about Saakashvili the provocateur as opposed to Putin the aggressor. And we also saw that even more clearly defined in connection with the Russian aggression in Crimea and in Donbass. Which is why we need clarity regarding what's happening in this region, clarity regarding Western principles and interests. This in no way says there are not local problems which give the Kremlin entree, but we need to see clearly what's happening and not be constantly making excuses for Kremlin aggression and putting it on the backs of the local peoples.
Let me follow up on that. Yeah, just, I mean, if you look at my book at Moldova, I mean, that's one of the general points I wanted to make, is that the major bone of contention between the United States and Russia was likely to be the attitude toward the near abroad, where the United States policy has historically been that these should be fully independent sovereign countries with their own choice. And Russia, from the beginning of the Yeltsin presidency, thought that Russia should have a special right of influence and direction. And it has remained that way. That having been said, and you know, one wonders what the Russians could do. I mean, Primakov told me the phrase he used was maximize Russian influence. But I had an independent Russian journalist only a couple of years ago said, I don't know what's wrong with us. You know, why we don't go to these countries? We've got tremendous influence. Why don't we use it to help them, to solve their conflicts? And we'd get much more goodwill than
I asked those same questions in 1994 and 95.
And you probably, well, we had a much greater degree of trust than we do now, obviously. I mean, I think the point I would make, and it's not to minimize the fact that the principal point that Russian troops have been in Moldova since the Russians took over the 14th Army in April of 1992. Well, the Moldovan position has always been that the Russian troops should leave. As a sovereign country, Moldova has that right to expect that they should leave. Right now, the situation, I'm not as worried about military activities. I mean, Moldova, the Moldovan organized instruments of force may have different uniforms, but Moldova has enough men under arms that can come out and under direction that I think Moldova is capable of withstanding any threat that Transnistria might pose. I hope I'm never proved wrong on that, but the point is there are always worries, there can be provocations, but the greater danger to me is not military and security, but is the failure of the Moldovan body politic to meet the expectations of, or the Moldovan institutions to meet the expectations of its citizenry. And that is, there are no Russians in the Moldovan parliament. There haven't ever been. They haven't had a vote. They're physically separated from Moldova, especially after 2014. There's no agreement to resupply the forces across Ukraine. But in this period, since 2009, pro-Western parties stole $1 billion out of the Moldovan economy that evaporated through banks in Latvia, Cyprus, off into Western accounts, and there is still only a minimal accounting of this. There are other instances where people have been on the right bank have been deeply disappointed, and to me that disillusionment in the performance of the government is a far greater threat than anything the Russians can do. I mean, the Russians are just not going to be able to get forces into Tiraspol airport and take over the country. But the government of the right bank could, be given by default to political forces that see a choice with going to the east because the pro-Western actors in Moldova have failed to perform. And that, to me, is something that needs consistent, attention not so much from the West, but from Moldovans. What we could do in the West, one thing, and I'll give you, Atlantic Council, a plug, because I've seen the recent paper of Dan Fried and Alina Polyakova on fake news and media, is we need, the cutting off, banning the Russian channels is to my mind, not the way to go. It's to provide content in Russian. And I would give a lot more money to Current Time and other efforts like this. When I was in Moldova in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were still VOA programs, Voice of America programs in Russian that were put on Moldovan TV. Moldovan media will put them on if we provide this. And this is something that we could do, that better than just calling Channel 1 and NTV fake news. Give some real news there. It doesn't cost as much as building F-35s or other things, but it can have a tremendous effect on the way the population sees things. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
Can I, yes, say a few things, yes. So theft of $1 billion definitely has not been investigated. No one has been really punished for this. There was another large scandal a few years ago where Moldova was involved in laundering money that was sent from Russian banks. A couple of years ago or so, there was a story about judges who were implicated in this crime. No one has been punished as well. Few people remember about this serious crime. I agree with Ambassador Hill that the government is failing Moldovan people, and this is going to have large consequences, unfortunately. It's failing to adopt the association agreement to make progress towards going to adopt when it comes to adopting reforms, and the EU is recognizing it. Last year, it punished Moldova for failing to promote reforms in the judiciary system by not sending another tranche of money for that. In December of last year, it also withheld the transfer of 100 million euro to Moldova because the EU said reforms in 28 different sectors have to be implemented. There has to be greater transparency of procurement, greater transparency of what the state-owned enterprises are doing, greater reforms in the judiciary, greater efforts to address corruption. So this is definitely a problem. I want to say a few words about the media as well, because for sure, the Russian media are playing a very negative role in Moldova. I couldn't agree with that more. And here I mean both traditional media and social media as well, because there is a very interesting recent study done by a think tank in Moldova, Institute for Public Policy, where they analyze what are the activities on Odnoklasniki. There are lots of groups, dozens of groups that promote anti-Western, anti-US, anti-NATO messages while promoting Soviet nostalgia and separatist sentiments. So yes, Russian media pose a very serious threat to Moldovan citizens, and yes, the Moldova has recently made attempts to address this issue by adopting by trying to ban the Russian content that is related to news, political analysis, and military stories. Unfortunately, this law is not. Has not been implemented, unfortunately, and I know for a fact actually that when I was in Moldova a couple of weeks ago, staying at the hotel, I was able to watch Russian TV channels without any difficulty. Banning news stories, political stories, and so you can argue that this is a step in the right direction. However, much of propaganda is spread through entertainment stories that are very popular with Moldovans. Moldovan contact of mine told me a couple of weeks ago that she was watching cartoons with her 3-year-old niece, multiki, which are very popular, obviously, in Moldova. There was an innocent story about animals chasing one another, and suddenly they are screaming, "Run, run, Americans are invading." You could argue that this actually also has military content, so probably should be banned as well. I want to finish by saying something on, by addressing the hypocrisy of the Moldovan government, unfortunately. We have to remember that the head of the Democratic Party, Mr. Plahotniuk, owns 4 TV channels, and one of them actually rebroadcasts Первый канал, Russian TV channel. So on the one hand, we are addressing the Russian propaganda, on the other hand, we're supporting it a little bit. Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah, Mark, if you allow me, I would like to provide a little bit of context and also suggest what we believe that the U.S. could help us with to address the issues that I raised. So I took over this post in December, well, technically in January this year. So I've been on the job for a few months, and before that, for 14 years, I haven't worked for the government. I studied in US at 2 universities, I worked for civil society, I worked for an international organization. So the reason I'm saying this is that I do not have any pragmatic, monetary or ideological attachment with the current government. Actually, I came because I saw how some of the issues that we're facing can be solved, and I know how to, well, I believe that I know how to solve them. So I see an opportunity in this position. Having said this, I'm a trained political scientist, so the way I view the situation in Moldova is that any economic development needs a secure environment in order to show a positive dynamic. That security threats, they create impediments for economic development. So having the Transnistrian conflict, for instance, or Russian influence, that affects a lot the ability of Moldova to create economic welfare, to provide, for the needs of their citizen. Now, also as a political scientist, I was trained, and I've seen evidence through many empirical researches that democracy emerges in countries. There is a very strong correlation, let's say, between economic development and democracy. And we don't know exactly the causality, but the correlation is really strong. So when we see economic development, we also see a more potential for democratic development. One of the reasons why it is, the story goes, that people are less dependent financially on the government. So they have less fear to protect, to defend their interest, and to actually go and speak up against the government and put pressure for them to conduct reforms. So one of the reasons I'm saying, all the stories that I heard from other panelists, they are unfortunately quite true. However, if we talk about helping Moldova, and this would refer to any other country in post-Soviet space, except for the Baltic states, which are doing quite well. If you want to help Moldova, I think we have to focus on the security challenges for a host of reasons. First of all, because very often security challenges are used by the government to excuse a lack of progress in economic development and in democratic reforms. So remove that, and they won't have this excuse they'll have to deliver. Secondly, by removing this and creating this economic development, we would actually give the citizens a less dependency in their income, salary from the government. They will be able to speak up against the government. They'll put pressure on the government, right? Therefore, when we talk about, and particularly I'm focusing on Moldova, I think the biggest focus should be at helping Moldova resist the Russian influence, in parallel with the promoting, putting pressure for democratic reforms. I'll give you, to make you understand how important context is in all those stories, I'll give you an example. Probably in 2009 or 2010, I don't exactly remember, there was an advertisement on the website of the Russian presidential administration, where they would contract researchers to conduct studies on on the interest of Moldova's oligarch and Moldovan economic system. There were a couple of those, so they wanted a couple of systems to understand what is the influence of Moldovan oligarchs on Moldovan economy, or what are the vulnerabilities of the Moldovan economic system. And a few years after that, we have seen those bank problems, right? That money was laundered through the Russian banks, that now we want to investigate those money laundering, and the Russians do not allow us to do it. We send governmental officials, police, to Russia, asking information about the Russian bank that participated in this laundering, and we are refused access to this data. So it's not that we don't do anything, we're not able to finalize the investigation. And also we have the 1 billion that was stolen, which is a lot of involvement of the Russian banks as well. And when we tried to put pressure in to get the data that would help the investigation, our officials traveling through Moscow started to be stopped, even though they had diplomatic immunity, some of them. They were basically, pressure was put on them and so on. That's why the government was forced actually to stop any traveling of officials through Moscow at a time. So I don't say that those two things are connected, because I don't have the evidence. However, I would not exclude that this study was used in order to run one of the political influence operations that Russia is doing very often, and not only Russia, many governments do. And that would fit very well into the hybrid warfare thing that I was talking about. When you don't need an army today to control, you can discredit a government, including by using the vulnerabilities of the governing system, knowing that maybe some people in the government would like to make some money. Maybe we can explore that. So this is why the context is important. Now, talking about what should be done, I think Moldova needs a lot of help in order to strengthen its strategic communication. That means being able to mitigate the effect of the Russian propaganda, both nationally, in communication with the citizens, and abroad. I'll give an example why this is important. The propaganda, the budget that Russia invests into its propaganda and influence operations is bigger than all our security sector reform budget. So all the money that we invest into national security is significantly smaller than the money that Russia invests into propaganda, which means that we absolutely have no chance in resisting that. So we do need support for that. Secondly, is we do need help to be able to resist or to deter potential paramilitary operations by the Russian troops. And Ambassador Hill mentioned that he was skeptical that something can happen because Russians cannot come with the troops to Tiraspol, but they don't have to. I was pointing out that there are around 15,000 of Transnistrian military which are trained and equipped by Russians, and there are another few thousand of Russian troops. And this would make up to probably 20,000. And our own military forces, they are both 3,000. So it's a difference, it's a huge disbalance. Now, when we're talking about this kind of operations that Russia conducted in Ukraine, you cannot use police to counter them because they're just not trained to skillfully address this kind of operation. You cannot send a policeman to oppose effectively military trained people. I mean, we can discuss that if you want additionally. Finally, we do need a lot of support to improve our intelligence collection and processing. Our ability to make sound decisions and to build up our defense system is impaired by the fact that we're not able to conduct this kind of operations. Again, for financial reasons, one of those reasons. Yeah, that would be it.
So I've still got a few questions, but I do want to give us time to turn to the audience for questions. We have about 30 minutes remaining. Please raise your hands. Please try to keep your comments succinct and ask a question. And it would be great if you can stand up as well and introduce yourself, and we can throw it open to questions from the audience, please.
Peach Gray, No Better Solutions. My question is about, Beach Gray, Novetta Solutions. My question is about education, and specifically about nonprofits funded by Russia in Moldova to promote Russian culture among youth and to encourage Russian-speaking Moldovans to study in Russia. I'm wondering if you can talk about education and Russian efforts to influence Moldova through education.
I was trying to find the answer to the same question. I reached out to my contacts in Moldova, and they were not able to tell me what organizations were funded by Russia and what kind of work they were doing.
So to follow up on that, if I may, the Russian government is providing scholarships to young people in Moldova with a focus on Transnistria in different universities. They also fund universities in Moldova that they teach in Russian language. Those are Slavic university. There are a number of others. I'm not an expert in that area, so I just know general information on that issue. In addition to that, there are this kind of targeting of Russian-speaking population is done through a lot of local NGOs, but that's mostly targeting audience at the professional level, so people who already graduated from university, and through different cultural activities. I cannot give you a number how many students per year receive scholarships to study in Russia. I don't think it's a huge number though, but this is not the main channel of let's say, trying to change hearts and minds of Russian-speaking population in Moldova?
Probably not as many scholarships to students to go to Russia as Transnistrian students who study in universities across the river in Moldova, which is the other side of the coin. What can you do? I mean, for the one thing is provide Moldovan or Romanian language instruction in places like Gagauzia, where they didn't used to start instruction in Moldovan until the 5th grade and then only had 2 hours a week. So of course they're going to look for stuff in Russian because they don't get other stuff. But the Ruski Mir, Brasa Trudnichestvo are all, distributing stuff there. And as far as I know, they're allowed to operate within certain bounds. As long as there's a population which is upwards or getting towards half the population whose primary or important secondary language is Russian, the field's going to be open there. More instruction in Romanian.
But a year ago, I attended an OSCE organized meeting in Chisinau that focused on Gagauzia. The meeting was for donors and for organizations as well, NGOs from Gagauzia as well. So there was a representative from the Russian embassy there, and he says, of course, we are very active when it comes to Gagauzia.
You bet.
It's nasz region. That's exactly the quote, But when it came to sharing what organizations they were supporting, he did not provide this information. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In the back.
Who else is there? It's Turkey.
Yes, I am Turkey, yes.
Hi, good afternoon. Alex Sanchez, I'm an analyst here in DC. Mm-hmm. 2 questions. In your opinion, what is the future of Article 11 of the Moldovan Constitution that proclaims that it has to be a neutral country, cannot take part of any kind of alliance? I know that last year NATO opened a liaison office in Chisinau. Do you think that the Constitution should be revised and Article 11 should be revised? And my second question, of pure personal ignorance, what is the status of Yevgeny Shevchuk, the Transnistrian leader that fled to Moldova of all places last year? I think he is right now in the Transnistria's most wanted list. What is his current status? Thank you.
Should I go on neutrality? Yeah. So on neutrality, I mean, I think I'm very much influenced by academia, so I cannot avoid going into providing some context. Neutrality per se is a concept that very much relates to war time. If you look at the international conventions that talk about neutrality, I believe that's the Hague Convention number 5 and some Geneva protocols, they all relate to times of war. So when we talk about neutrality, we mean that a country should be neutral between two belligerents. That's one condition. The second condition is that a country should not allow military forces of other countries on its territory, because in this case, during the war, any of the belligerents can actually conduct military operations. So the neutrality status is not recognized in this case. So following from those premises, assumptions, technically, if a war would start by international law, probably Moldovan neutrality would not be recognized by belligerents because we have Russian military troops on our territory. The second point, talking about the constitution, we have to look how this was included in our constitution. It was the early 90s, and the Republic of Moldova just got independence. We haven't had any foreign and security policy experience before. So the ruling political class thought, okay, if we include this neutrality concept in the constitution, which was encouraged by Russia, then probably this would be a reason for the Russians to leave the country, to withdraw their troops. And that was the agreement. A lot of people that were part of the government in early 90s, they claimed this was the case. And as a fact, we included the neutrality status in the constitution. We did our part of the deal. The Russians did not do their part of the deal. One thing. Second, since neutrality technically refers to war, to the period of war, participating in military exercises should not affect. I mean, I'm not a expert in international law, but if there are any here, I would love to be, to hear any disagreement on that. But technically, we definitely can do military exercises, because another condition of neutrality is that we should provide for our security, right? Not allow other forces to come on other territory, because then we lose the benefit of neutrality. So therefore, we have to be able to build up our defense capacity with whomever we choose. Now, we cannot join a military bloc or alliance, which we don't do. But cooperating, I think the status of neutrality does not prohibit us in doing that. But you're right, this concept is very much speculated in Moldova. And mostly, I would love to do, when I have time, to do actually an assessment of the debates about neutrality, and to look at some quantitative data to see what are the sources that advocate that Moldova as a neutral country should not cooperate with the US and NATO, should not do exercises. I suspect 100% would come from actually abroad, from Russia. There is a very considerable campaign that through the Russian media, through which this idea is brought into Moldovan media market again and again. And the political discourse nationally is fed with this idea. And the people, they don't understand. From their point of view, simple people, they would say, well, being neutral, that means not engaging into some violent things, that's a good thing. So yes, we want to be neutral. And the whole story is never delivered to the population. So therefore, you have, the recent polls show that very high support of Moldovan neutrality. But that's another thing why we need the strategic communication assistance, so that we can also give the full story to the citizens, explain them what being neutral means, and why conducting our security and defense cooperation with the United States, with other friends in the West, that's actually the correct thing to do. And what was your question?
Shevchuk. Mm-hmm.
Oh, as I said, I came to Moldova, to take over this post literally a few months ago. I was away for about 14 years. So I don't know exactly what is the status, but I did read that he briefly came to the right bank, and then people say that he went to Germany or to Moscow and so on. But I cannot give you any objective response on that.
I heard he's in Moscow because this is where he's making posts on Facebook from.
Here you go.
Right here, in the middle.
Hi, Stephanie Rowland from IRI. Quick question. Moldova has a series of elections coming up, municipal elections in Belt and Chisinau, and then important parliamentary elections in the fall, and then very quickly after, local elections. What do we think, what are we to expect for Russian interference in these elections? And then seeing these elections as kind of important, as 2019 sees important elections for Ukraine. So maybe kind of some trends that we'll see. And also picking up on are we going to see more of the same from the 2016 presidential, or do you think there'll be something new to watch out for?
Some of the speakers could
Yeah. And also, if I can add, particularly Ambassador Herbst, with you being in Moldova recently, and it being, a campaign dominated by personalities with Dodon and Plahotniuc, kind of your view of how the situation is on the ground in this election would be, I think, welcome.
Okay. So,
Do you want, or?
so ask that question, I'll speak to Mark's question.
All right. Well, I expect the parties right now are determining whether they're going to put candidates forth and who in the local elections. The issue involving Russia right now is the mayor of Belt, Usati, who is dodging a Moldovan criminal indictment in Moscow. Some of the candidates may well turn to, seek Russian endorsements if they think that's to their advantage. They've done it in past. I mean, my experience from watching Moldovan elections since 1994 is that I expect them to be more or less free, more or less fair. The 2014 elections had a couple of glitches in them, but generally they've been competitive and they've been relatively open. When the Russians have tried what we would consider dirty tricks, most of the time I think they've been caught. That doesn't mean they won't try it again, but I would certainly expect Russian support in media and what you can discern in support of especially the Socialist Party, which is explicitly more favorable to Russia. The big debate is where the pro-European vote is going to go. And there, the question of Plahotniuc versus the two candidates that came out of the street, Nastase and Maya Sindu, and whether they're just going to split the pro-European vote so that the socialists take the parliament by default, which is basically what happened in the election of 2001, or whether the anti-Eastern forces unite into a single bloc, which probably is a little bit larger than the electorate that the socialists can hope to garner in this election. But it's very close, and it's going to be very competitive and therefore very bitter. I would expect charges from all quarters of unfair or nasty practices. Some of them may actually be the truth. But
I just want to add that Russia will be utilizing the media for sure to promote the Socialist Party. It will also utilize the Orthodox Church in Moldova. And I have a flyer actually from the past elections, presidential elections. I liked it so much that I kept it. The flyer says who's supporting Igor Dodon, this is the top, and who's supporting Maya Sandu. So the top says that who supports Dodon. So it's people who respect Moldovan state, people who are Christians, and here it says actually that Dodon has helped dozens of churches and monasteries throughout Moldova, and the church endorses him as for president, and then families. And this is in contrast, who's supporting Maya Sandu. So oligarchs, people who support unification of Moldova and Romania, and homosexuals. So this is it. I have no doubt that the church will continue spreading this kind of propaganda. And also it's quite significant that in September, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow will visit Moldova. He will participate in a large congress of families, and where Igor Dodon is actually going to be the guest of honor. So the church will also play a significant role.
I was in Chisinau 3 weeks ago for a very interesting event. The Speaker of the Moldovan Parliament, Mr. Kennan, invited the speakers of Georgia and Ukraine to collectively meet with other parliamentarians from Europe to talk about their common problems. Now, I'm telling you this in response to Mark's question regarding the personalities and the dynamics of politics in Moldova. This event was very important for Moldova's sovereignty, because Moldova banding together with Georgia and Ukraine is more likely to be able to counteract Kremlin hybrid war more effectively. Now, this was an initiative of Mr. Kennan and his party. As a consequence, this was not an initiative supported by other members of the Democratic camp. And that, to me, is a weakness of the culture of the Democratic parties in Ukraine. Their complaint, and we heard about this because the Atlantic Council, was part of this event, and we met with many people, many political parties in Chisinau 3 weeks ago. And their complaint was that this event was going to be used for political advantage by Mr. Plahotniuc and his party. And in fact, if you watch the coverage in the Russian media, which Mr. Plahotniuc controls, the complaints of Ms. Sandu and others was correct. But the point was, the two groups, despite their differences, should have been able to come together to support this event, which was manifestly in the interest of the country and their vision for the country. But they were unable to do that, which is a sign of political immaturity. We see similar phenomena in Georgia. We see similar phenomena in Ukraine. And if you are a close student of American history, you will have seen similar phenomena in this country in the 1790s, as the party of President Adams and the party of Mr. Jefferson fought it out over such issues as revolutionary France. So this is a problem in the political maturation of Moldova, which needs to be overcome for the good of the country.
Over here, in the back.
Alexander Naumov, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. My question is, what suggestions can the Moldovan experience provide to the proposed peacekeeping operations in the Donbass, particularly on operational details and also on the official involvement of Russia?
Yeah.
Well, I think I can give you some answer on that, since I used to work for the Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for a year. OSCE has traced the ground, in a way, has prepared the ground for the current framework. One of the main things, and Ukraine is working hardly to do that, is to avoid allowing Russia to become a mediator and hide behind its proxies in Donbass. So that's a usual strategy, where what Russia does, it's say, okay, we're not party to the conflict, you talk with the Transnistrians, they are party to the conflict, we are mediating. And what this does is reducing the cost of sustaining and maintaining the conflict, right? Because there is no political pressure, international community would not put pressure, since internationally Russia would not be recognized as an aggressor. So that's very important. Over the years, those costs would pile up, and that would make more difficult for Russia to manage when the peacekeeping comes into place in the eastern regions of Ukraine. That will be very difficult, costly for Russia to maintain, to Transnistria, to create a similar situation like in Transnistria. Second element, however difficult it might be, there are trade-offs, of course, having a UN operation, but it would be actually, there are good elements. There is no ideal solution, but a UN operation with this impartiality and with a diverse set of factors, I think that would provide, that would cancel a number of Russia's tools to basically freeze the conflict at a specific status quo that they would like.
Professor Herbst, I know you have an opinion on this.
I think you've covered most of the things that need to be avoided. I would simply add that I believe the Ukrainian government is well aware of the problems of the Transnistrian peacekeeping model. That's why they're insisting if there be peacekeepers, they have to come from the UN, they have to represent nations which are not in any way under Kremlin influence, and that there are clear red lines relating to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, which are really not quite observed in the case of Transnistria.
And I would also add that, the model of Moldova and Georgia was also taken in the context of either a lack of Western engagement because of an interest in maintaining positive ties with Russia, or a perception, at least in Georgia's case in 2008, of a biased Western engagement. So with the United States and the freedom agenda, and of course with France taking lead as the mediator in seeking to freeze the conflict in place and not really worried or concerned about what would happen years later. It's important, again, and this is, I think, Ambassador Volker is the perfect person to lead U.S. engagement on trying to resolve how the future of Ukraine and the Donbass would be, is that you have to have a realistic stance of what our end state is. If we're trying simply to freeze the conflict and we're willing to accept Russian occupation as a result, you're going to get a situation very similar to Moldova. If the goal actually is to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and create a situation where the Donbass is integrated in a future Ukraine that's either federated or confederated, there are steps to take, and part of that is to remove Russia's presence. But again, without the intervention and engagement of the Minsk group and the Western partners, particularly the United States, you're not going to get pressure on Russia to remove itself from the conflict, and you'll see a Moldova situation repeated in Ukraine.
A very quick remark, if I may, to adjust to this. I'm sorry, sir. So, and a third thing would be actually to help Moldova avoid a solution to the Transnistrian conflict that is imposed by Russia, or as according to Russian plan, which is basically to create a special status for Transnistria. Why this is so? If this is implemented, there will be very practical and political pressure on Ukraine and on the Western friends of Ukraine to accept this, because it worked, because it's a good example. So it will be very difficult to reject such a framework or elements of it. So it is in the interest actually of Ukraine to help Moldova avoid a special status for Transnistria in our case.
So we've got about 6 minutes. I'm going to bin 3 questions together, starting over here.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Since the term hybrid warfare was mentioned, what do you say is the source of the Russian concept of hybrid warfare? I mean, President Putin actually has rejected the use of the term hybrid warfare for whatever reason. Sometimes the U.S. analysts call it the Gerasimov doctrine. But then again, we apparently coined that term. But in any case, General Gerasimov gave this speech in 2013 and outlined what he called new type warfare. And it's interesting that the peacekeeping operations were one of the things he lists there as part of the new type warfare, that's actually apart from in their concept of warfare. So is that basically, though, how you see the Russian hybrid warfare coming from General Gerasimov, or is it broader?
I had one more question over here in the back.
Thank you. Vitaly Yakono, Eurasia Foundation here in DC. One issue of the Russian influence that was not so much addressed is the issues of issuing of Russian passports for citizens, for people in Transnistria. And for example, if we take the elections for the Russian Federation, we see that around 70,000 voters voted for Putin, so which is a large amount. But my issue is, since with the election of President Putin the last term, do you expect any progress, for example, in the Transnistrian conflict during his last term? A few years ago, there was very popular idea that Transnistrian conflict, unlike other conflicts, could be a successful model of cooperation between EU, US, and Russia to bring to a solution. Do you think this idea is still valid today? Can we expect any breakthrough progress during the last term of President Putin? Thank you.
And I'll take one more question before we turn to the last intervention. If there are any others. So first question is on hybrid warfare, the source of it, and the second obviously is passportization and prospects for settlement of the conflict in Transnistria.
Well, DOD or many professionals reject or don't use the term hybrid warfare. It's a misnomer. There's a spectrum of conflict ranging from political and non-kinetic activities up to various types of kinetic activities. Gerasimov specifically, in his article in Военно-промышленный Courier and then his speech to the Moscow Security Conference, was talking about what he alleged the West is doing to Russia. And I can show you, I've got a screenshot of that one year where he shows where we start out politically and eventually undermine and then get peacekeeping forces in, leading to full conflict. And this is the Russians' justification for what they were doing in Ukraine, is that the West is already doing it to us, so we're going to do it to them. So, it's conflict that can start small and go through various ranges. You can find terms, but the misuse of hybrid warfare sometimes just leads us not to know what we're talking about. Let me, and the others can take shots at me then, but the conflict in all of these local conflicts differ somewhat. I used to use Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. There are similarities, but there are also differences. Over the last year or two, the Transnistrian conflict has actually been making the negotiators have been making great progress on moving this towards solution. The agreed solution since 1993, accepted not only by Russia, but by the United States, all of the Western countries, and by Moldova in the OSCE, is that Transnistria is an integral part of the Republic of Moldova, but it should have a special political status adequate to protect the rights of the local population. Status unspecified. It was nearly solved twice, once in 1997, another time in 2003, very close. I'm the guy that torpedoed that one in 2003, or at least I got blamed for it. They're moving closer now. A great, Moldovan Latin script schools are working. A bridge across the Dniester that was damaged in '92 has reopened to traffic. There are still problems in there, but in this sense, this is one of the exceptions in Moldova. The president, the prime minister, and the parliament are all working together on putting together a Moldovan vision of what they want, and the international parties that have been involved in this have also all managed to stay on the reservation. Will it get there? Past experience suggests that we'll get close and then it'll fall apart again, because this is what has happened twice before. But Moldova is one of the anomalies, stuck on the other side of Ukraine, quieter, where actually more has been done over the past year and a half to move local issues towards some sort of cooperative solution than has been done anywhere else in this particular part of the globe. Are there lessons here for what might be done elsewhere? Perhaps. One is to focus on what is agreed, to start from the bottom up and work gradually at restoring trust. Many of these don't apply to places like Georgia or Ukraine, where very different things have been done and different situations pertain. But I'd toss that in just at the end to say, at least as far as I look at it, the situation in Moldova is not all bleak. I mean, there is promise there. The question is how to save and nurture the promise without getting involved in a lot of undesirable stuff, and that remains a daunting task.
We've got about a minute with each guest able to respond and answer the final question. And any closing remarks?
So on Transnistria, I tend to be more pessimistic, unfortunately, because I think it is in the interest of Russia to keep, the frozen conflict there. I also think that it's not really the future of Moldova of Transnistria is not really part of the discourse in Moldova. Moldovans don't care if you ask anyone in Chisinau what they think of Transnistria. They never travel there. They never. They don't really think. They have enough problems of their own not to think about Transnistria. If Moldova were to, if Transnistria were to come back to Moldova, Moldova will have to carry the burden of 140,000 people who collect pensions. It would have to sort of solve the problem of unpaid gas debt to Gazprom. It would have to deal with the serious economic problems in Moldova. And then lastly, the Moldova state, I mean, think of all the constituents in Transnistria, who they vote for, you know? So I'm slightly less optimistic here. When it comes to passports, yes, a lot of Transnistrians have Russian passports. A lot of them have Moldovan passports as well, because now that Moldovans are free to travel around the EU, Moldovan passport is quite valuable. So I was recently told that even the wife of President Krasnosielski has a Moldovan passport, which is a bit ironic. Okay, I will stop here.
We've heard a lot of good things in answer to the questions relating to both hybrid war and whether there'll be progress in Transnistria. I'll just say on passportization, this has been a critical part of Kremlin policy of subverting its neighbors. They've used it in Transnistria, they've used it in Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia, they used it in Crimea for years and years before the little green men appeared. And this will continue to be part of the Russian policy of Ruski Mir, to try and make sure that their influence in the areas around Russia and on the periphery is as high as it can be.
So very shortly on the hybrid warfare. So if we look at the, yes, partly I was referring to the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. And he also, while blaming that the West was doing so, he also was tracing or suggesting that Russia, this should be the Russia's approach towards waging warfare. What I would add to this, though, is a very important element is combining or exploiting democratic institutions to advance the war goals. That means controlling territory, controlling resources, controlling policies of other states. That would be the only difference. I would say that makes it a little bit different from our classical understanding of warfare. Talking about the conflict resolution in Transnistria, recently the Association for Foreign Policy in Moldova published a study that I co-authored before entering this position, where I explain why the perspective that Ambassador Hill outlined, why this might not be, an optimistic view, let's say. So if you are interested in the topic, there is a good English translation, so you could look more at it. But the basic thing is that giving a special status to Transnistria, this is exactly what Russia does. So let's see how this is operationalized. That means giving them, in the Russian perception, this is giving that region an improportionately high ability to block the domestic policies. So through this is the whole goal of the conflict being initiated in the first place, that through Transnistria to block Moldovan's European Union aspiration and so on. So that would be actually, it will actually stop Moldovan integration into EU. And second thing, when we talk about giving special rights to people in Transnistria, those are like roughly 30% Moldovans, 30% Russians, 30% Ukrainians. We actually, what we do, we do not give the same rights to other Russians living in Moldova on the right bank, in higher numbers. And they do not complain that their rights are violated, at least not more than some Moldovans saying that their economic rights are not, respected very much. They would like to earn more money. So we would discriminate against other Russian ethnics in Moldova by giving a special status to Transnistria. Then we have to give special status to Belts. We have to give special status to Edinets, which is another region heavily where you have a large Russian group. So that's actually a no-go.
So again, thank you for coming today. It's a rare luxury, frankly, to have a panel on Moldova, but I do think it's critical that we try to understand what's going on there, particularly in light of a focus on Russia. This is also part of the Atlantic Council series on exploring Russian influence across the region. And again, based on the interest in the questions, this is something that's going to be timely to focus on this year. I really want to thank the panelists. There's a lot of experience here on Moldova, but particularly Mr. Mînzărari for coming all the way from Chișinău just for this event. It's critical that we got to get your perspective on the ground. Thank you again for coming, and look forward to working with you on this.
Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.